The organizational structure at Southcross Law Firm was typical of any law firm. The underlying operations were managed by the firm in coordination with its lawyers, but each individual lawyer was relatively independent. As a result, a lawyer's work never overlapped with another's, and they each had a large office to call their own. Once the door was closed, they could isolate themselves from the rest of the firm, and were usually left alone, barring extraordinary circumstances. It was the type of work setting where one could pretend to be blind and deaf. Just don't bother me. Joseph had gotten used to this kind of work culture years ago. However, Miss Fizz wasn't aware that he was accustomed to it, and while they were moving his items into the office, she purposely lowered her voice and said, "Sharing an office with a lawyer isn't easy. New interns are always nervous, and I totally get it. Last year, there was a young man who was too scared to even go to the bathroom on his first day. I remember when I saw him at lunch, his face had turned green, and when I asked him why, he said the office felt too quiet and confined. He was afraid that the slightest movement would cause his teacher to take notice. His willpower must have been truly admirable," Joseph praised. "Don't laugh," Miss Fizz continued. "Over the next little while, it's possible that you and Lawyer Gu will spend a lot more time outside rather than inside the office. However, I hope you can still feel a sense of belonging here. Even if your desk isn't as large as Lawyer Gu's, this is still your office, and at least 30% of the territory is rightfully yours. So use it freely, don't hold back, and be confident." Joseph wasn't sure if she was aware of it herself, but to his ears, she sounded like she was reciting a eulogy. It was clear that Miss Fizz had underestimated him. Not only was Joseph brimming with confidence, but he had nearly turned the tables and become the master of the house. Every time his mind wandered, he subconsciously began thinking of the office as his. It was easy to think of the chair he was currently occupying was actually the lawyer's seat, and the aloof student Gare, who was sitting across from him and drinking coffee, was actually the intern he had blindly picked up because he didn't have enough headaches, as it were. It was to the extent that he nearly opened his mouth a few times to assign Garrett some work to do. Thankfully, he had quick reflexes, and each time he opened his mouth, he instantly recovered his senses and slammed on the brakes, then schooled his expression and calmly closed his mouth again. He blamed his delayed reaction on the coffee. It was far too hot, and the dense cloud of white steam made it much too easy to zone out. Also, the design of office was all too familiar. At first glance, the place may as well have been born from the same womb as the dean's office he had once occupied. Furthermore, it bore a strong resemblance to his lawyer's office at Southlew as well. Joseph's eyes took in his surroundings, and for some odd reason, he was struck by a small sense of gratification. Although their teacher-student relationship hadn't been all that great, there were still some intrinsic qualities that had been inherited. It sure looked as if a certain aesthetic had been passed down, didn't it? Joseph smiled cheerfully and was about to compliment the office's design, but before he could open his mouth and squeeze out a few words, Garrett had already set down his coffee cup and said condescendingly, "I wasn't planning on taking on any interns." Garrett's voice was pleasing to the ear, and his tone was particularly unperturbed. If one were to ignore the actual words he was saying, it was easy for listeners to feel the urge to listen to him speak a little more. However, this wasn't the first time that Joseph had met Garrett, and he had basically become physically immune to the effects of Garrett's voice, and any misconceptions it could create. Moreover, the contents of Garrett's speech were simply impossible to ignore. "So you're not planning on accepting interns?" "What a coincidence, I was thinking along the same lines." "Actually, you can just pass me along to any of the other lawyers. As long as I don't have to be here with you, anywhere else will do." Joseph gave these inner thoughts a mental polish and edited them into a format that was less likely to piss someone off. He was about to open his mouth, but Garrett spoke again, giving his coffee cup a light swirl. "As a result, I haven't made any preparations ahead of time on your account. I heard that the firm has an experience manual that gives an overview of how tasks should be assigned to interns. Apparently, it keeps interns too busy running around to cause trouble. But I've never flipped through the manual myself, so I can't guarantee that you'll have a normal internship experience. Joseph raised an eyebrow. He seldom had the chance to listen to such a long speech from Student Gare outside the courtroom, and at first listen, his words were relatively tolerable. Of course, it was merely tolerable, and was a far cry from delightful. After all, the speaker was more or less expressionless, and his tone was just as cool as before. Joseph wasn't particularly interested in the type of experience that one should gain from an internship, or what duties Garrett planned on assigning him. He didn't care much about the details. Instead, he was more entertained by the fact that Garrett was actually talking like a proper person. However, if you can speak properly to an intern that was forced on you, then why did you always pull such a long face at the professor that you yourself handpicked after careful deliberation? In his mind, Joseph let out a deep, regretful sigh. But it didn't matter. Perhaps his new identity and these new surroundings would give him the chance to get along with Student Gare. At least they had started off on the right foot. However, his wave of regret didn't last long. The office hologram on his desk suddenly spat out a whole pile of holographic files. Lawyer Gu was not a talkative man by nature, and he had already reached the limits of his niceties after the long speech he had just delivered. And so, after a handful of words, he simply sent Joseph the internship manual that Fizz had prepared beforehand. "Take a look," Garrett said. "I'm going to take a call." Joseph's finger swiped at the holographic screen a few times. Fortunately, the manual was not as lengthy as he had imagined, and there was little redundancy. Overall, it was fairly concise and quite suitable for a young intern's mentality. It was rather spirited too, and certainly reflected Miss Fizz's style. He briefly skimmed the sections detailing the internship experience and certain rules set by the firm. As a matter of fact, he skimmed through the entire manual. After all, he wasn't truly a novice, and he hadn't come here for the internship experience. Head propped in one hand, he casually flipped through the pages until eventually, his gaze paused on a particular number. Internship salary, $60 per day. To a student, $60 was just enough for 3 meals a day, and there was no point wondering if there'd be any extra left over. However, this kind of pay was commonplace among law firms in Dekarma. There was a unanimous, if unspoken, agreement that during the early stages of an internship, interns were actually more trouble than they were worth. A lawyer assigning tasks to an intern did so with a knife pressed to their heart. The reason being, once an intern is finished with the task, there was an 80% to 90% chance that the lawyer would have to redo the whole thing, while simultaneously offering suggestions for improvement. It was basically like doing double the workload. Among the interns, there were also some who simply coasted along, and their illustrious contributions were the reason for the increased risk of lawyers working themselves to death. "Not only are you an inconvenience, but you're a danger to my health. The fact that I'm not charging you tuition and am forced to pay you a significant sum must mean I'm dreaming, right?" The interns themselves were well aware of the situation, so there was little objection to a stipend-like salary that was essentially paid as a matter of form. After all, they would have a chance to recoup it one day. When Joseph saw the salary amount, his initial response was to let a mental tiesque and an empathetic sigh on behalf of these poor students. However, he suddenly remembered that right now, he was a poor student himself. He choked on his sigh before he could finish, and began coughing so much that his world felt upended. While he was recovering from his coughing fit with his head in his hands, Garrett's voice had somehow drifted closer. "What's the time and place? Yaba Island? I'm not going." Garrett was still on a call with someone but had filled a glass of water in passing, and had set it on the intern's desk. Joseph started, then raised his head and looked over. Had Student Gare gotten out of the wrong side of the bed today? To think there were actually times where he would act concerned. In the end, he heard Garrett rap the surface of the desk with his knuckles. He glanced down and said coolly, "I'm rather curious about what part of the manual made your face so red that you look like you're about to pass out." How remarkable. The toxicity radiating from Garrett was spot on. Garrett didn't have his headset on, so the voice of the person on the other end was on speaker. However, the volume was on low, and Joseph barely managed to hear a few words at close range. "What do you mean about to pass out?" a male voice asked on the other end. "Who are you talking to?" Joseph actually felt that the man's voice sounded rather familiar, but at that moment, he couldn't remember where he had heard it. "The intern," Garrett said. "Fine then," the man replied. "So you're really not coming? I extended such a sincere invitation, but you're not even going to bother giving me face? Even Gita's coming along." In an instant, Garrett's face became even more frigid. Soon enough, Joseph understood the reason behind the sudden change in his expression. "You're really bringing along that aquaphobic dog of yours while you surf between planets?" The corner of Joseph's lips twitched a little. "Who are you calling an aquaphobic dog? She falls asleep at 2 a.m. sharp every night and is even more punctual than you. It wouldn't feel right if I had to spend even one day apart from such an amazing dog." The man on the other end was a chatterbox and prattled on for a long while. He seemed to be trying to persuade Garrett to attend some party or other. However, Joseph couldn't hear the rest of the conversation, because Garrett had already walked back to his own desk. After that, no matter what the person on the other end said, Garrett simply gave curt replies that put an end to the discussion. "No. I'm busy. I have a court appearance." Joseph pondered over it a little more, and still felt that the man's voice was familiar. However, before he could figure it out, Garrett had already hung up and was looking over at him. "You're finished with the manual? Do you have any questions?" Joseph shook his head, then paused midway when a thought suddenly occurred. "Oh, hold on." After speaking, he tapped on his smart device and selected the asset card interface. When he glanced at the balance, the choking feeling suddenly returned. After taking a spin around the black market, the money he had left over was barely enough to last him the week. Hence, he raised his head and flashed Garrett a smile. "I do have a question." Garrett nodded, indicating for him to continue. "Can salaries be paid in advance?" Garrett stared back at him, face expressionless. He fell silent for a moment, then said, "You've been looking at the manual this whole time and that's your question?" Even the esteemed Professor Yan, with his bushy wolf's tail, felt as if his thick skin couldn't hold up much longer. 2 seconds later, Garrett calmly pulled out an internal communicator and said, "Fizz, please transfer 3 months of pay to this intern and then tell him to go home." The Joseph who had thought that he could get along with Student Gare had probably ingested leftovers that had already gone bad. Where the heck did Garrett pick up the habit of sending someone packing without another word? It sure wasn't me who taught him that, Joseph thought to himself. Joseph would never wear a long-suffering expression if he were sending someone packing. Instead, he would simply tell them to get the hell out with a smile on his face. However, he couldn't afford to get the hell out at the moment. He hadn't even read a single punctuation mark from the file about the explosion case yet. Joseph shot a glance at the newsfeed that hadn't yet been stowed away. It was 10:15 a.m., which meant that only 1 hour and 11 minutes had passed since it was announced that he would be assigned to Garrett. He had probably set a new record at Southcross Law Firm. Less than an hour had passed since he had reported for duty, but he was already being mercilessly booted from his post. It was unprecedented. Perhaps it was because it was such a sudden turn of events, and was completely beyond what he had anticipated. But Joseph wasn't actually that angry. In fact, he almost felt the urge to laugh. He was the kind of person who was rather impudent when it came to his speech and his actions, and he tended to do whatever came to mind. As a result, one corner of his mouth lifted. And so, when Garrett eventually hung up the call and turned his head, he was met with the sight of an intern who was still smiling, even though he had just been asked to leave. The intern's eyes as well as the corner of his lips held a hint of a faint, cheerful smile. Oh no. Joseph's smile suddenly vanished and he lowered his eyes to gaze at his fingertips. He used a finger and pushed aside the translucent screen blocking the way, then gazed up at Garrett once more. "I'm so sorry." "Like hell you're sorry." Joseph could almost see these exact words written across Garrett's stony face, but Garrett simply pressed his thin lips together and frowned back at him. Garrett then wordlessly looked away, almost as if his very lifespan would be shortened if he so much as glanced at Joseph. The computer on the lawyer's desk let out a series of warning beeps, and then whirred to life as it spat out one holographic page after another. The pages formed a small stack in front of Garrett, but showed no signs of stopping. From the looks of it, he really was rather busy. While the computer frantically beeped away, Fizz rushed upstairs. The brisk staccato of her high heels sounded almost as if she were about to go into battle. It was only when she stepped onto the gray carpet in Garrett's office that the sound was abruptly cut off. Goo? I was at a bit of a loss just now and was halfway through the process before I realized it. Fizz pulled the door closed behind her and quickly shot a glance at Joseph. What's the matter with the intern? It's only been an hour, but you're sending him home? Garrett lightly tossed aside the document in his hand, and the holographic paper automatically returned to its original place. I said I'm not fit to take on an intern. Huh? Joseph was startled. He had thought Garrett would have used his behavior just now as an excuse, and tossed it out as some sort of justification. On second thought, however, the past Garrett had acted as he had now. He seldom offered detailed explanations, and rarely involved a third party to argue about who had started it and why he had retaliated, even if he had good reason to do so. It was almost contrary to how one would act in the court of law, and it wasn't clear if it was an occupational habit. Some lawyers become increasingly adept at arguing in their private lives, and would prattle on about facts or evidence. Garrett, however, seemed to be the complete opposite. As Garrett spoke, he didn't spare a single glance at Joseph. It was almost as if the eyes beneath his knitted brows had already seen enough of him. Fizz wasn't convinced by his words. But I thought Adams had already talked you into it an hour ago. You took a look at the intern's file and accepted. He said that even though you didn't seem very willing, and had even given him a few jabs, you still agreed in the end. I quoted him word for word, you know. Joseph was even more astonished. Anyone who looked at his barren file would assume he was dead weight that was simply coasting. Otherwise, why did the other lawyers select their respective interns and left him for Moore, who wasn't on the scene? They were all worried about adding unnecessary stress to their lives. And yet, given his personality, Garrett had actually nodded his head when he had reviewed that kind of file. You've got to be kidding. If his and Garrett's student-teacher relationship back in the day had been one of beauty and tranquility, he certainly would have suspected that Garrett had recognized him and was reluctantly bending the rules for his sake. Unfortunately, the reality was, if Garrett had truly recognized him, he probably would have been booted from the office even sooner. What's more, he wouldn't have received a single penny of the 3 months' worth of salary. The esteemed Professor Yen was very confident in his assessment. I did agree at the time, Garrett said, but now I've changed my mind. But whenever you agree to something, you never go back on your word, Fizz said. You've never gone back on your word before. Well, I have now. Fizz looked as if even her high heels were about to snap. The 3 months' worth of salary is compensation for going back on my word. He can seek out more in 2 weeks, Garrett said. Huh? What? Fizz quickly glanced over and blinked at Joseph. Seek out more. Garrett breathed through his nose and replied coolly. You want him to seek out more? So you're not trying to get him to leave? Even though Garrett had already returned to the information on the computer and didn't bother answering the question, his rigid silence could be taken as another form of assent. Joseph was at a complete loss. Even though you're so pissed that you won't even look at me, you're still not asking me to leave? And on top of not kicking me out, you're actually giving me money? Student Gerwin, are you sleepwalking? Honestly speaking, Goo, you've been acting kind of weird today, Fizz commented. She had taken the words right out of Joseph's mouth. However, this was the only sentiment they shared. A second later, Fizz added with a grin, but it's very charming. If you really were going to ask him to leave, it would be quite the hassle on my end. After all, we have an agreement with Mays University, so if we rejected a student, we'd have to hand over a whole bunch of documents. These days I get dizzy just looking at words on a screen, and the very sight of a document makes my organs hurt. Lawyer Gu, who had remained largely silent, finally spoke up. I get dizzy just looking at interns. All right then. Either way, you seem to be brimming with goodwill today. There was no rationality behind Fiz's compliments. Ryan, what do you think? As she spoke, she turned her head towards Joseph. Ryan? Who's that? The esteemed Professor Yan smiled faintly and gazed back at her for 5 seconds. During these 5 seconds, the entire office was flooded with a stifling sort of silence. Fiz's high heels were about to snap again. 5 seconds later, Joseph finally remembered the fake name that God knows who had given him. Ryan. Ryan. If someone were to use just one of the characters, it was kind of. Joseph mentally replaced the word Ryan and said, Everything I've said in the past hour was inappropriate, and I truly apologize. It's why I'm a bit too embarrassed to even speak at this point. No worries, new hires are bound to make a few mistakes. It would be odd if they didn't. Miss Fiz rambled on about how mistakes can be overlooked and forgiven, almost as if she was talking in enormous circles. In the end, even Garrett, who had been minding his own business and reading through his document, couldn't listen anymore and looked up. So when exactly are you going to transfer this intern to Moore? Miss Fiz cleared her throat. The reason I've been talking in circles was so that I could get to this point eventually. And? He can't be transferred. On what grounds? I'm actually pretty efficient, so his registration papers have gone through the entire process, and it's been linked to your name already. The committee's already approved it, so the transfer can't be done. Fiz snuck a glance at him. So what you're saying is, you didn't accomplish a single one of the tasks I asked of you? Garrett said. No, I did manage to take care of one thing, Fiz answered. I've applied for the advance salary payment to be processed. The moment she finished speaking, Joseph's asset card let out a ding to announce a new notification. To make matters worse, the smart device had been in his possession for only a few days, so he hadn't changed any of the settings. The device was still in its default setting, and the crisp sound of the system's synthesized voice declared, Payment received, $4,680. Category, Salary Advance. Account of origin, Business account of Garrett. Processed by Irene Fiz. Current balance, $5,022. You had to admit, Southcross Law Firm was sometimes terrifyingly efficient. Why didn't you ask about the situation first before doling out the money? And it was Garrett's money that was being doled out too. The office once again sunk into a deathly silence. It was difficult to say what part of the smart device's announcement was more dizzying. A moment later, Fiz swiveled her head and gave Joseph an almost incredulous look. If the salary advance hadn't been transferred, your balance was only about $300. How are you going to survive? Even Garrett, who had been averting his eyes this whole time, turned to gaze at him. Joseph shrugged his shoulders and said casually with a smile, Thankfully I didn't have to find out. Perhaps it was because his balance was so dreadful, but Garrett seemed stunned. In the end, the whole fuss that morning about asking the intern to leave was left unsettled, and Joseph was officially stationed in Lawyer Gu's office. Moreover, he had received the acknowledgement and acceptance of the Lawyer Gu himself. Garrett left him alone and was so busy that he barely paused to rest. Midway through, he found some time to contact an administrative assistant downstairs to deal with an issue, then left the office after receiving a call. Before leaving, he put together a package containing the past 5 years of case documents and unceremoniously transferred it to Joseph. Organizing files was a task that almost all interns would receive at the beginning of their internship. In the past, Joseph himself had delegated this type of work to interns, and was no stranger to the task. Truth to tell, this kind of job was tedious, dull, and blinding. It was incredibly annoying. However, Joseph was extremely pleased. Why had he borrowed the identity of an intern to enter Southcross Law Firm? It was so that he could take on the type of task that no intern could avoid. This way, he could openly investigate all sorts of detailed information about the explosion case from start to finish. Joseph's computer spent an hour just spitting out holographic pages, and it worked away until lunchtime. When folded, The holographic documents were stacked so high that his desk and his very person were basically buried alive. In the end, the computer finally shut its trap only when the other intern, the blonde kid, came by to ask if he wanted to eat. Oh God, that many? Luke sighed. Was Lawyer Gu in charge of all these cases? I don't know, I haven't looked too closely. Joseph let the documents collapse, and in an instant, one page after another was compressed into a thin surface that didn't look quite as daunting as before. The simulation is a little too good sometimes, Luke said. Did he tell you when you have to finish organizing it? And why do you look so pleased about it? It was because Joseph could finally take a look at his cause of death. However, Luke would probably be terrified if he were to say the thought aloud, so Joseph was very considerate and made up an excuse. It's because we can finally eat. When he and Luke set off, they bumped into a few of the other interns. Together, they found a restaurant close to the firm. Let's cherish this rare opportunity to sit down and eat a good meal, grinned the intern named Philida. Once things get busy, we won't be able to eat properly again, and we'll probably start shedding pounds without even trying. Once she was finished speaking, another intern named Anna glanced at Joseph. Ryan, how come you're eating even less than us two? Joseph's problem was one that was common to many lawyers. He didn't have a very good stomach. The problem was rather annoying, but it wasn't a be-all end-all. If your stomach endured so much that it went to waste, you could simply undergo an operation to switch it out for a new one. Though it wasn't a life-threatening operation, it wasn't a matter to be taken lightly either. After all, stomachs couldn't be replaced constantly, but you still had to eat every day. You had to be careful at every meal, so as to avoid upsetting it further. Joseph had to be especially cautious these days because he hadn't eaten normally in half a year, and couldn't ingest too much at the moment. However, he didn't like discussing these little ailments, and so he unhurriedly swallowed a mouthful of food, and took a sip of warm water. He grinned at them and said, I have to tackle so many files when I get back, so I better not eat too much. I'd just throw it up. Luke, who was already on his second helping, choked on a mouthful of pasta and turned his head to cough like a true idiot. When they were halfway through lunch, Joseph suddenly received a message. It was a notification from the apartment he was staying at. When his savior had rented the apartment, they had used his fake identity and his smart device's contact number and hadn't left a single trace. The content of the message was fairly short. There were only 2 sentences, and once Joseph glanced over it, he had trouble keeping his food down. The apartment was notifying him that his rental period was coming to an end tomorrow, and that if he wanted to extend the lease, he had to pay the rent up front. Half a year's worth of rent. In all his years, the esteemed Professor Yan had never felt stressed about money. He hadn't even looked at his files yet and already felt like throwing up. The message also said that he would receive a call shortly that would carry out a voice confirmation with him. 5 minutes later, Joseph suddenly got a call from a number he didn't recognize. He figured it was the apartment that had called. He picked up immediately and smiled as he said, Sorry, I won't be extending the lease. He had no money and wouldn't dream of renting it. On the other end, the caller fell silent for a few seconds. To his surprise, they didn't say a word and hung up. Joseph couldn't make head nor tail of it. Normally speaking, customer service reps didn't have this kind of attitude, right?